An investigation by the online news site Politico has concluded that there was, quote, a persistent double standard in the Trump administration's handling of recovering efforts following Hurricane Harvey in Texas and Hurricane Maria, which hit Puerto Rico especially hard. Both were severe storms causing widespread damage. As examples, Politico cites that 9 days after the hurricanes, FEMA, the federal disaster agency, had approved over $140 million in individual assistance to victims of Harvey versus just $6 million in the same time period for Maria victims. Even presidential attention was unequal. Trump visited Houston twice in the 8 days after the hurricane. He made one visit to Puerto Rico nearly 2 weeks later, and he sent 3 times as many tweets about Harvey. It's a disparity, Politico reports, that continues today. The federal government has begun funding projects to make permanent repairs to Texas infrastructure. In Puerto Rico, not yet. Lilah Mejia, Coordinator of Evacuee Services at New York Disaster Interface Services, is here. Thanks for being with us, Lilah.
Thank you.
So how would you describe the government's handling of those 2 disasters, Maria and Harvey?
I think that the government's response to Puerto Rico has been a disappointment to families from Puerto Rico as compared to Texas. I don't know if it has a lot to do with the history of Puerto Rico and the fact that Puerto Rico is a colony and it's still under a lot of rules from the United States.
Not recognized as a state.
Exactly.
Although Puerto Ricans, we should say, are American citizens.
We are American citizens. However, we're not being treated as American citizens, even from the relief that's happening to currently 6 months later, how we have no electricity, a lot of the island, and even the resources that are provided here to the families who've migrated to New York City to call it home. There is no resources.
When you say there are no resources, do you mean no federal resources?
Usually in an event of a disaster, FEMA tends to activate disaster case management for families. They activate disaster food stamps for families. However, we have yet to see that. The city decided to open a service center for families where they can gain resources such as Medicaid and food stamps. However, that's fallen short for a lot of families. A lot of our families have been displaced into shelters or not there in FEMA hotels, which a lot of families, 60%, have had denials. So they're in the FEMA appeals process, which takes 60 to 90 days.
We talked last week to a family who actually are staying in a hotel funded by FEMA, but they risk losing that housing in just a couple of weeks.
Exactly.
And have no idea where they're going to go. They no longer have a home in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, that's the sad reality. Currently, the city has about 17,000 immigrants, well, not immigrants, but evacuees who come in from Puerto Rico. A lot of them are staying in hotels. We have about 400. A lot of those families fear after April 20th or May 14th extension, they have nowhere to go. Last week, we were at a hotel in the Bronx in which the hotel owner decided that he no longer wanted to be in the program, and he opted out, and 18 families were displaced, and we had to rush to quickly place them in other hotels, and unfortunately, 2 had to go to shelters because TSA ended for them.
And where is your organization getting its funding from?
We get our fundings from a lot of our congregations with the churches. However, we're not funded to do this work, so my boss is looking at other alternatives to fund me, but there is a need for money. We're in desperate need, and we're asking people to fundraise. You know, a lot of the money is going to Puerto Rico, which is rightfully needed. However, we need funding for the resources for families here. Families need homes, they need jobs. They need proper health care, and we currently don't have any system set up. We don't have disaster case management. It's not like the mayor's fund has given out anything for families. So we're struggling to provide resources to help assist our families like Liz Cruz so that they're not displaced after April 20th and the many other families that we have.
Do you think that for many of those families that have made the decision that they had to get out of Puerto Rico because conditions in the island were just not sustainable for them, do you think that that is basically an irrevocable decision, or there will come a time when people still hope to be able to return home?
For my assessments, I was at the service center and I interacted with 3,000 families. 60% of them stated that they wanted to make New York City home. 40% stated they wanted to return, and that was more the elder families. Prior to the hurricane happening, Puerto Rico was already, experiencing devastation with no jobs. Families were getting paid $9 an hour. There was no assistance there. So a lot of families came here hoping as this a new start, but now they're struggling with where, how. It's a really tough cycle right now that families are dealing with.
Did you think so many months after the hurricane that you would be dealing with people who were still struggling so hard?
No, not to this extent. I've dealt with other hurricanes, and I've seen how cities, communities have activated to assist families, and I am still in shock as someone who works in the disaster field and as a woman who is Puerto Rican. I'm actually devastated with the fact of the resources that are going to my island and how I was just there a month ago and, I was still assisting families with insulin, water, and just basic needs. And it's just not being broadcasted. People are no longer talking about it because it's not popular. So people assume that it's okay because you see major cities like San Juan or Ponce going, they've recovered.
Coming back more or less,
But it's more, if you look at the island of Puerto Rico, there's a lot of mountains, and that's where a lot of our families live, and that's where our families are struggling here on the island and here on this island in Manhattan.
So going forward, how will you talked about your boss basically trying to do some additional fundraising in order to keep these programs going. What about federal funding? Are there additional federal funds that could be made available?
We would love it if our governors kind of pushed our federal government to assist more. If FEMA would actually provide rental assistance for families like they do in other disasters, right, for 18 months. Right now they're only offering TSA programs. They're offering for families to leave the island, but they're not offering for families to return.
I want to ask you about sort of the psychological state that a lot of these people are in. This is obviously very difficult. They went through a very difficult situation in Puerto Rico. As you said, many people were struggling before that because of the economy, because of difficulties with regards to that. And now many of them have faced the trauma of losing their homes. How are people coping psychologically?
Psychologically, our people are not coping. The reality is that we're having 2 suicides a day. The suicide rate has skyrocketed and it's not being spoken about.
And that's on the island?
That's on the island. So we have families who come here, and when we do an assessment, we usually ask them what are their most pressing needs. And it's usually housing, food, making sure their children are okay. And then when we ask about their mental health, it's, well, once we're situated, we'll deal with that. But we have majority of our families who come in who are very traumatized still, who have problems sleeping, who have problems navigating now this system. I think that it's something that's not being spoken about, but there needs to be more access to mental health services for our families.
Thank you so much. Lilah Mejia of New York Disaster Interfaith Services, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.